Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. Yesterday we introduced the book and just sort of began our study of 1 Corinthians. Now today I want to turn to the book of the Acts of the Apostles. You may say, why don't you turn to the Acts if we're studying Corinthians? Well, I want to look at Acts chapter 18, which is the account of when Paul founded the church in Corinth. And by looking at this, we can get some idea of the date that he wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians. Now in chapter 18, we are told this, first few verses. Paul left Athens and he went to the city of Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, who was a native of Pontus. He had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Now this little verse helps us to know exactly when Paul first arrived in the city of Corinth. He teamed up there with Priscilla and Aquila, who became partners with him in the gospel for the rest of his life. And we're told that he met them in Corinth, and we're told they had recently come to Corinth from Rome because Claudius had expelled all the Jews from Rome. Now we know from other sources, historical sources at the time, that Claudius, the Roman emperor, issued this edict ordering all Jews to leave the city of Rome in AD 49. We know that with certainty. So if Priscilla and Aquila had just recently come from Rome to Corinth and Paul met them, it's more than likely we're in the year AD 50 when Paul first arrived in Corinth. Now AD 50 is 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. We know that Jesus was crucified in the year AD 30 and rose again. So that is the beginning of the Christian church. So we're 20 years now into the Christian movement. These followers of Jesus are spreading around the Roman Empire. And Paul is now bringing the gospel to the city of Corinth. Now a little bit later it tells us that Paul spent a year and a half in Corinth ministering. And then we have this very interesting thing in verse 12. It says, when Gallio was proconsul of Greece, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. They said, this man is persuading the people to worship God in a way that is unlawful. So there was this attack against Paul. They brought him before the Roman governor. That helps us state as well. We know that Gallio became governor of Greece, living there in Corinth, in the year AD 51. And so obviously Paul's trial before Gallio occurred sometime after AD 51. So he probably arrived in Corinth in AD 50, probably stayed at least 2 years because after the trial and he was acquitted, we're told he stayed for a while longer. So probably Paul stayed in Corinth for about 2 years, leaving in AD 52. Now after he left, he goes back to Jerusalem for a visit, and then he begins his third missionary journey, and he goes to the city of Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, or Turkey today. We know from Acts chapter 19, he spent a couple of years ministering in the city of Ephesus. And we also know from the letter of Corinth, at the end of the letter, that Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. So, putting all these together, we know that Paul started the church in Corinth in AD 50, ministering there from 50 to 52. And he probably wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians we know of sometime around AD 54, AD 55, AD 56, somewhere in that range. So, the church in Corinth is probably about 5 or 6 years old when Paul writes the letter to them. In those few years, the first 2 years Paul was with them, the last few they've been carrying on their own. They've grown, they've started a small revival in Corinth. The church has expanded, but they've also run into some issues and some difficulties. So while Paul is in Ephesus, he hears about the questions they have about the faith, the difficulties they have encountered, the issues they're trying to work their way through. And so he writes this letter explaining to them some answers to the questions and how to work their way through some rather difficult issues. So keep in mind, this Corinthian church is about 6 years old. The oldest believers in the church have only been a Christian for a few years. So it's natural they're learning some things. And so Paul is trying to teach them how to handle problems, how to handle difficulties, and answer some questions about the heart of our Christian faith. So I believe as we get into detail in the coming days in the letter of Corinthians, we're going to learn an awful lot about how to handle difficult situations, how to solve problems, and how to answer theological questions, because Paul deals with all of that in his letter of 1 Corinthians. So I hope you'll stay with us each day as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. I look forward to seeing you next time.